Did you know in 1974, then Republican Governor Ronald Reagan appointed educator Dr. Claudia Hampton, a Democrat, active in her local NAACP, as the first Black woman trustee to the board of California State University? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about educational activism with Dr. Donna J. Nicol on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll discuss race, education, philanthropy, and Black women's educational activism with Dr. Donna J. Nicol. But first, a trivia question. How much money do people donate to colleges and universities in the United States? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Nicol on the show today. Trained as an educational historian, Dr. Donna J. Nicol is the Associate Dean of Personnel and Curriculum and Professor of History in the College of Liberal Arts at California State University, Long Beach. She is the author of Black Women on Board, Claudia Hampton, the California State University, and the Fight to Save Affirmative Action. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nicol. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
What's the most unique thing about you?
I am a fourth-generation college graduate, and my great-grandfather was a doctor in the U.S. Army during World War I, and so everyone is totally floored by that. And it came about mostly because my great-grandfather was able to attend a historically Black college called Shaw University, and they had a medical school at the time called Leonard Medical School. So he was in the first or second cohort of the university to get his medical degree. It was shortly thereafter closed down. There was a man by the name of Flexner who was funded by Andrew Carnegie, who went across the South and started closing historically Black college medical schools. But my great-grandfather was able to get his degree, and then he couldn't get work because he was a Black man, even though he had a medical license. And so he went and enrolled in the Army and was stationed in the Philippines. And that's where he met my great-grandmother. And so they had the first 4 kids in the Philippines. And then they moved back to Arizona for a while during World War II. He was in charge of a group of Black nurse orderlies, and then eventually settled in California. So that's how my family kind of moved around. But my grandmother studied Chinese history and spoke Mandarin fluently. My mom studied Latin American history, and I am the African American historian in the family.
And tell us about your new book. What motivated you to write Dr. Claudia Hampton's story?
Yeah, so my book, Black Women on Board, really tells 2 stories in the same book, which is the story of the California State University system and how the system really dealt with affirmative action and diversity, but also the story of the Black woman, Claudia Hampton, who was the first Black woman trustee and the first woman to ever chair the board. And really what motivated me to write the book was largely because I discovered her by happenstance. I didn't even know who she was, and I saw a picture of her in a digital archive. And the notation said, Trustee Claudia Hampton, appointed by Ronald Reagan. And I just thought that was particularly odd, knowing or at least assuming what I knew about Ronald Reagan and his politics. But as I started to dig in a bit more and learn more about her, I realized that there hadn't been enough written about civil rights after the civil rights movement. It's almost like the 70s and the 80s is like this kind of postscript to the civil rights movement, and we just stopped talking about everything after King's assassination. But there was civil rights activism that was going on, and particularly taken up by Black women, and that narrative had not really been written. It had been more or less omitted. You know, what you would get next is the Black Power movement, and any type of kind of woman narrative is pretty much erased. So I wanted there to be a fuller accounting of what Black women did, particularly in the 70s and 80s, to help advance civil rights, but that you would typically not hear in most US history courses.
You challenged the notion that, as you said, Black civil rights activism ended in the 60s, and you've examined the key role that Black women played as educational activists in the 70s and 80s. Why is that important to you and to the broad population?
Yeah, I think it's important because education has and continues to be really important in terms of helping African Americans get social mobility, to be able to get into politics, be able to kind of change these type of stereotypes and narratives about who we are. And so Black women as educational activists is really looking at women who are not necessarily teachers or faculty members, but are using their voice some type of way to ensure that Black youth get an opportunity to get a quality education. I think there's this kind of long narrative of this, particularly starting back in slavery when Black people are not allowed to read. And so, as soon as Black people do get freedom, they set up Saturday schools and literacy clubs and all the things that's necessary to get an education. Yeah, it's really important to kind of document and push back against this narrative that Black people are not interested in education.
And tell us what sly civility is and how it's used by Black women educators and academic leaders to change predominantly white institutions from within.
Yeah, so sly civility is a resistance strategy that was developed by cultural theorist Homi Bhabha. And in his explication of sly civility, Homi Bhabha talks about how when you're a person who is typically kept outside of an institution or the centers of power, that you need to be civil toward the people who are in power so you can gain their trust and then gain access to their resources and their knowledge and all the opportunities they've been afforded, and then slyly pass those things back on to your community so they could benefit. It's really this kind of pragmatic approach toward kind of activism. You're using relationship building as a way to circumvent the what Homi Bhabha calls the colonizers' penchant for violence. So instead of going in this kind of radical, coming in hot, clapping back or carrying guns, you kind of do the opposite, and you build a relationship with folks who you are typically diametrically opposed to in order to help advance your community. And for Black women in particular, this is an effective strategy, particularly in the 70s and 80s when there begins to be a backlash against affirmative action. You start to see there's the first federal case against affirmative action in 1974, and it was thrown out on a technicality. But then by 1978, you have the Bakke decision in California, which gets rid of kind of racial quotas. And so it narrows the focus of affirmative action. So all of this backlash against affirmative action and against all the gains of the civil rights movement is going to require a new approach. Well, you already have the Panthers, that's one approach, but that approach is resulting in people going to jail or being killed. So you can't rely on that. And so sly civility provides another vehicle to approach civil rights activism. And it's not just Claudia Hampton doing this. There are a number of Black women, some across the country. They're contemporaries. They don't know each other. There's a woman by the name of Bertha Maxwell Roddy who did very similar types of relationship building when she became the first Black woman to ever become a school principal in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so these women know that, they have very little kind of power or kind of social capital. And so what they do have is their wits, and they're going to use those wits by making people feel comfortable enough to let them into their spaces.
What is conservative philanthropy and how does it relate to the corporatization of the academy?
Yeah, so conservative philanthropy is philanthropy that is where you take three disparate groups and they came together at the turn of the 20th century. So these three groups are libertarians, what they call the traditionalist, and then the anti-communist. And they were all kind of functioning in different ways. The libertarians are more focused on fiscal policy, fiscal conservatism. The traditionalists are more focused on strict adherence to religious dogma and the separation of the races. And then the anti-communist deals with foreign policy. They all despised Franklin Roosevelt. And so that's what threw them together was their opposition to the growth of the liberal welfare state. And what's undergirding a lot of that is their fear of the kind of browning of America, where you're starting to see a growth or expansion in, the Black population and the Latino population, Asian population. They're very, very concerned. They have these kind of white racial fears of being displaced. And so they have to come together and try to cut off liberalism because even though Roosevelt was kind of a disingenuous type of ally to the Black community, they perceived him appointing Black people to his Black cabinet, which is an informal advising group to the president. They view this in like kind of apocalyptic terms. They feared when the passage of the Wagner Act, which would allow for employees to unionize. So they saw all of these things as undermining the status quo and disrupting their lives. And so those groups came together and they had to figure out a way, how do we change this narrative? Well, the way we do this is through philanthropy. We start to create a philanthropic infrastructure to counterbalance the liberals. And so initially they start with these big corporations. So Fred Koch starts first. Then they go to Richard Scaife, and those are the big ones in the beginning. And he creates, the Carthage Foundation. Adolf Coors creates, Castle Rock Foundation. And they lay low for a little while. They're kind of quiet. And then all of a sudden, when Ronald Reagan becomes elected as president, they reemerge in the form of the Heritage Foundation in the 1970s, in 73, and they supercharged the Reagan campaign. All of this has an impact, like a long impact. I'm actually working on a book project that traces this long history. But what it does is by the time you get to the 1990s, one of their first real tests is to try to get rid of affirmative action. And so they're pumping money into higher ed to get rid of affirmative action. So they would fund scholars like Dinesh D'Souza and fund projects like the Pioneer Group, which was this kind of eugenics group. There was a lot of ad campaigns calling for a culture war to save the soul of America in college and university classrooms. So all of that kind of building in the 40s and the 50s made way for the erosion of affirmative action in California in the 1990s. And now in 2023, we have this kind of nationwide dismantling of affirmative action. So they've been working on this for a long time. And so the last chapter of my book deals with this conservative philanthropy as it's kind of scary to know that people have been operating with this dislike of affirmative action for so long that they've been planning for it. And so it directly hits on the woman that I wrote the book about, and she's trying to preserve affirmative action. She's trying to implement affirmative action, and here are all of these folks on the opposite side using their vast resources to undermine it.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the documentary film you were in. It is called The Big Picture, A Race for America, and it aired in February of 2021. Tell us about that project and your involvement in it.
Yeah, so I was contacted by Al Jazeera, a producer who was working on a project that initially was trying to kind of explain Trump and the Trump effect on various aspects of American life. And eventually, what the producer started to find was that philanthropy was at the heart of propping up the Trump presidency. And so they ended up going on this kind of long path, going backwards in US history, and started to realize that philanthropy was ordering social relations between the races in the United States. And so that's what the project does, is it actually provides a really good overview of how race relations was impacted by initially Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and it takes it all the way to January 6th, the attack on the US Capitol. So I was asked to participate because I am one of the only scholars in the country that does my research around race and conservative philanthropy. Everyone else pretty much writes about philanthropy, how it's been used to help Black people. I write about conservative philanthropy that has been used to, I'm going to call it, undermine the gains that Black people have made in terms of affirmative action, in terms of healthcare access, and things like that. So I write about this kind of negative usage of philanthropy. So they reached out. It was in the middle of the pandemic. We started filming in 2020. Since my university was on lockdown, we were able to use my university because no one else was around. And so I sat it was like an 8-hour interview. And I saw when everyone else saw it. I didn't know how it was going. But what I was doing was I was filling in some gaps, because in order to study conservative philanthropy, you have to understand liberal philanthropy. And so I had been studying philanthropy for quite some time. So I talk about, in various pockets of the film, I talk about the liberal positive philanthropy, positive with an asterisk. But mostly I talked about my research area, which is philanthropy that deals with the 20th century.
And on your website, you mentioned you enjoy traveling with your husband. What were some of your favorite places to visit, and why?
I would say probably my favorite most recently was Scotland. Went there last year, in part because I am like a castle and museum nerd. So wherever there's a castle, a museum, a library, I really enjoy it. I actually, in the Caribbean, I had been to St. Thomas before, but it was like the touristy part. But the next time I went, I said, take me where the locals go, and that was a eye-opening experience. It wasn't like a glamorous trip. It was more like, this is how folks are really living, like the behind the facade of what a tourist boat or trip would look like. But I enjoyed it because I learned a lot. And I have lived abroad too. Well, I've lived in Manchester, England, and so I enjoy England, even though the weather can be dreary.
And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
Just that even though I am currently in an administrative post, I am still a very committed researcher. And so, as I said, I'm working on a second book project that traces this long history of conservative philanthropy in the US, to try to kind of make sense of how we are in this very current moment, but from a philanthropy perspective, how money gets used to dictate not just elections, but social relations in the United States.
And I will have a link to your website and to your book in the show notes. It was great to have you on the show, Dr. Nicol. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. How much money do people donate to colleges and universities in the United States? According to the Council for Support and Giving in Education, voluntary donations to colleges and universities in the USA reached over $59.5 billion in 2022. We'll end the show with something punny. Why was the broom always late for class? Because it overswept. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.